My name is Greg Downey. I'm an associate professor of anthropology here, and it's my job to try to introduce you to the breadth of development studies in culture change and anthropology. I'll talk more about anthropology, but I will touch on the development studies program, which I think is a really interesting option if you'd like to do anthropology in conjunction with some of our partners on campus who provide really good stuff as well. So that includes human geography. It includes even offerings in economics and sociology in that development studies program. So much of what I'll say today will apply both to development studies and to anthropology, but I'll focus on what our department does because those other departments are getting their time. So some of you might be asking, what is anthropology? In fact, when I came to Australia, it's one of the first things people asked me. They often thought it had something to do with ants. That's not, in fact, the case. Anthropology has nothing to do with ants. Anthropology comes from the Greek. That's very unhelpful, I know. Anthropos. Anthropos means humanity, or human, or man, in the old way of talking about it. And ology, of course, comes from the root of to study. So to study humanity. Now, that seems fairly obvious, except you're probably wondering, well, wait a minute, how's it different from sociology, or psychology, or any other any other of the academic disciplines that study humanity? And that's what I'm here to tell you. The first is that anthropologists study human diversity. This means that we don't believe that the people in this room, for example, are an accurate representation of all that humans are capable of, or all that we actually represent a kind of unusual subpopulation, a small fraction. And to really understand humanity, we have to study humans all over the place, whether that's from the Siberian nomads who hunt elk, whether that's people living in a Brazilian rainforest, or whether it's people dwelling in a slum outside Lagos, or in an incredibly impoverished village in rural India. Wherever it is, we think that to understand humans, you have to go to where they are. So at Macquarie, we tend to specialize. You probably run into some discussions of anthropology where they talk about archaeology or primatology. But at Macquarie, we specialize in study of extant, that is, living cultures, both socially and culturally around the world. So there's this focus, first of all, on living cultural diversity, and I'll talk about what we offer in terms of classes, but also that we focus on training students to do what we call ethnography. Ethnography is an anthropologist's stock and trade. It's a research method which basically involves going to where people are doing whatever you want to study and following them around, watching them do it, and talking to them about it. It's kind of like stalking with an academic license, all right? We don't believe that you can get an accurate representation of people by dragging them into a lab or by giving them a telephone survey. We think that that's a very distorted view of that if you really want to understand, for example, how humans use computer software, you need to actually go sit alongside them at their desks for a couple hours and actually watch them use it. And in fact, there are anthropologists who do this kind of work. Microsoft is one of the leading employers of anthropologists in the United States, for example, because they study user research. How do users actually use technology? How do they understand it and see it? And in some cases, we use quantitative tools like surveys and psychological tests and tools like that, time activity surveys. But in some cases, we use quite what we call qualitative approaches. We ask people, what do you think you're doing? Why do you do that? What does that mean? What does this ritual mean? Why do you care so much about Australia Day? What does this symbol mean to you? How does your religion affect your decisions? What about this decision you just made? So that's the kind of approach. So ethnography is what anthropologists do. And this has made it, some people argue that it's actually become quite a fad right now in business to get anthropologists on board as management consultants, as marketing consultants, and as human resources people, because we have this sort of deep method that we use which involves us really getting into people's lives and trying to get into their heads that way. So to give you an example, just to sort of talk about, historically, up until, say, in the 1950s and 1960s, a lot of anthropologists focused on technologically simple cultures on the margin of European empires. So usually countries specialized in the cultures of the people that they dominated. So you could tell who the English anthropologists were going to study because they would study those people in the English colonies. You could tell who the Brazilian anthropologists would study because they would study the Brazilian Indians. You could tell who Australian anthropologists would study because they would go study Aboriginal communities or they would study communities in Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, things like that. You studied technologically less sophisticated people close to home. But around the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, this really started to shift. And today, all bets are off for this. In fact, around the 50s, 60s, and 70s, anthropologists began to focus more on a much wider diversity of human variation. So now they study large-scale societies and the difference within them. So by going to China, how is one region different to another? How is one group different to another. I just had a student who finished her PhD who was doing work at the Chinese Diplomatic University to study how Chinese diplomats were actually developing their worldview at that critical period before they were then tested to see if they could go on and to join the Foreign Service. So she was examining how the Chinese view of the world gets shaped at a university in Beijing, which I think is fascinating. So the respect for and interest in human variation is still a hallmark, but the location and the peoples we study have really changed. In fact, you can now find anthropologists in virtually any setting, whether that's a trading room floor in Wall Street. A colleague of mine worked with women who were trying to break into Wall Street and how they were dealing with the old boys networks. Whether that's places like medical schools, we have some great research on how medical students come to understand their patients and how they come to understand the body. In fact, we find that they cut corners a lot. They don't actually use scientific knowledge. They use all kinds of really interesting cheats in the way they understand how, for example, how they don't understand how drugs work necessarily in a molecular way. They cheat and learn what they do. And the other one is things like design workshops. I worked as a design consultant when I was in graduate school. I worked with a company that helped companies that were suffering redesign their products. I think it's long enough ago that I can mention companies like Samsung who were suffering because their products were seen as kind of daggy and out of date. What were the symbols? What were the things about the products that made people think that way? And that was one of my jobs as a design consultant. So anthropologists now work in a wide range of settings. In fact, I would say the majority of anthropologists do not study technologically simple societies. So take you some examples from our own department. The unifying factor, though, is this ethnography, that we believe you should study people where they live. You should study the local reality. You shouldn't assume that you know what other people are thinking. You shouldn't assume that just because they're Christian, that means the same thing to you as to them, or just because they're Muslim, that necessarily means the same thing all over the Islamic world. You should study them in context, that by taking them out of their homes, out of their workplaces, you actually distort what they'll do, taking them away from their familiar surroundings. In their familiar surroundings, they might behave very differently. And finally, that humans are inherently varied. I'll tell you what, I don't believe there's such a thing as human nature. I believe there are many human natures. I believe that humans are teachable. And one of the groups that I study, I'll come back to in a second, I study elite athletes. Because in some ways I'm really fascinated by the way that they push the boundaries of what is possible for a human body. So I study free divers and endurance athletes, and one group I'll mention in a minute. We have a lot of good colleagues. Lisa Wynn, one of my colleagues who teaches one of our most popular courses, Drugs Across Cultures, which is open first semester. Lisa was just in the news because her research was one of the projects singled out by the incoming government as frivolous. It's really interesting, actually, because she studies how new reproductive technologies, things like Viagra, even things like hymenoplasty, when women have their hymens surgically restored, are used in the Islamic world. And what's interesting about it is when you ask people these questions, you're really asking them how they interpret religious authority in their life. Do they listen to their religious teachers, or do they do what they damn well please? And what Lisa finds is a really interesting relationship between Islamic teachings and Islamic practice in Egypt. So it was really interesting that this was singled out as a project that Australia had no interest in, because to my mind, that's one of the most fundamental questions right now is what's the relationship between what religious leaders say and what people actually are willing to do? And a place like Egypt would seem to be an ideal place to study this. So Lisa, an incredibly popular teacher, and one of the ones I'll come back to in her courses. Jaap Timmer, this is Jaap playing the ukulele. He studies ethno-religious movements in the Pacific. Why, for example, places like the Solomon Islands are so volatile. How come they keep throwing up these religious leaders, what these religious leaders are telling, how they interpret Christianity. Incredibly important for understanding rivalries, because from the outside we tend to think of these rivalries as ethnic. But they're actually not. They're much more complicated. They're often religio-ethnic. They combine village identity with whether somebody is a Seventh-day Adventist or one of the new Christian movements that's spreading throughout these islands. So he's one of our key instructors if you're interested in our master's program. He teaches our core master's course. And he also is very important in our development studies program. He frequently works with the World Bank and other organizations because they are trying to, one of his projects is to help rebuild justice systems in places like Indonesia. How do you use local law and try to get local law to dovetail with national law so that you don't have to reinvent courts in every single island, which would be prohibitively expensive and be impossible. So how do you take local traditional forms of justice and harness them to a state system of justice? Another, Aaron Denham, who's going to be down in the booth when we finish up, is a medical anthropologist. He studied the incidence of infanticide in a place in West Africa. And it was incredibly interesting because a lot of groups on the ground there were saying that the local people were killing their own infants. And they had this whole theory of spirits. And when Aaron went there, he found out that children were being called spirit children only after they died. That is, they weren't being diagnosed as spirit children and then killed. They were failing to thrive because of malnutrition and disease. And then after they passed away, sometimes after they had bankrupted the family, trying to save the child, the family would then say, oh, we couldn't have done anything anyway because it was a spirit child. And the local authorities would then say, right, you killed it. And they would go to Western governments or Western religious groups and ask for money to change these primitive people, when in fact they were never committing infanticide in the first place. They were talking about why the children had died. And what was really the problem was infanticide and lack of prenatal care, lack of postnatal care. And so the groups that were saying, there was a dominant group that was using this tradition to disparage the local people and to misidentify what was really the medical problem. Aaron teaches our Introduction to Anthropology course. He's a fascinating guy, joined our staff a couple of years ago. Really interesting on all kinds of levels. My own work is in Neuro Anthropology, the relationship between brain and culture, especially around physical training and skill acquisition. I teach our human evolution and diversity, and I've worked on capoeira, which is an Afro-Brazilian martial art, and written a book on it. I've worked on cage fighters. I'm very interested in pain tolerance and how different societies tolerate pain. But more recently, I've been working on rugby and on echolocation. Some blind humans are able to hear space. And there's activists now coming out of the United States and increasingly in Australia who are teaching blind kids to click and hear objects. You may have seen this there's some Discover documentaries on one of the guys I work with. And I'm really interested in how they've discovered a new human sense and how they're teaching blind children. They ride mountain bikes. I've taken one of them out in Sydney and it was mind-blowing. He was walking around sensing telephone posts, for example, by clicking. And I could really barely even hear him doing it. So, our students, this is just a selection of some of our other staff. We're very lucky to have an India specialist, Associate Professor Kalpana Ram, who works on development, family planning, and childbirth. She's also the director of the India Studies Center, so if you're interested in India. Associate Professor Chris Littleton, who's down there right now but might be gone, who's got a lot of projects on HIV transmission in Southeast Asia, has been consulted by governments in Southeast Asia on how to prevent HIV transmission. What are the particular vectors that people use, how they get HIV in different places? He's even going into Burma now and looking at how HIV might be spreading into Burma. Chris Houston, who's our head of department, works on Turkey, looks at, one of the things he looks at, it sounds kind of esoteric. He looks at urban geography and violence, which sounds like it's esoteric. But one of the things that happened in Turkey was that the nationalist government redesigned cities to make it very hard for people to join together in demonstrations. And we just saw in Turkey an example of this with the city parks and the getting rid of public spaces. And one of the reasons was because that was a way to control people. Control their space, control the urban environment, control how people can come together. And so it's a really interesting, I think, geography project that talks about the relationship between geography and social movements. Deborah Van Heerkeren looks at conversions to Christianity in Papua New Guinea. And Gabrielle Moranchi, one of our other new staff members, is one of the leading scholars of the anthropology of Islam globally. He's done he's actually got 4 or 5 books out. I can't even tell you all about all the stuff he does because I don't even know half of it. But one of the really interesting projects he got involved with prison conversions in Scotland. He was invited to come into prisons in Scotland because the prison officials were really upset that people were converting to Islam. And he sort of interviewed the prisoners and really tried to understand how religion was working in their lives. And what he actually ended up advising the Scottish prison officials was, let them convert. This is their way of actually trying to rebuild their lives. And if you discourage them and if you give them food that is inappropriate, they're actually trying to teach themselves self-discipline because they want to reconstruct their lives. And so he ended up advising the Scottish officials to encourage some of these conversions because it was a lot of dignity and self-respect that was being built through religion. So a really interesting case. Our students also do fun research, fascinating projects. I'm going to whiz through these because it's already 1:15. One of our former students who just got a job working on epidemiology project looking at tuberculosis transmission in Indonesia, which should matter to Australians very much since there's the possibility of drug-resistant TB on our doorstep if we're not careful. Studied music perception in Indonesia. We've got other student just finished, a visiting student from Canada, looked at Indian dance as a global social movement and how Indian gurus were using global movements to build their own stature at home. And so basically the globalization of art. She became a disciple and she talks about how hard it was to live in the guru's house and be expected to be learning 24/7. The only time she could even write notes was when he went to the bathroom or took a nap. So she talks about how hard the fieldwork was. Monty, who's down at the booth right now, looked at indigenous health in India and actually discovered that in certain indigenous groups, the rate of suicide was being severely undercounted. He basically discovered a suicide wave that was occurring among indigenous tribal peoples in the hills of India that was not being recorded by the government. Because he went through each individual case and recoded the cause of death and figured out that there was basically there was no mental health happening. One of our students, Paul Kyle, who's come back to us to do a PhD and is now off in India studying elephant-human relations, did his undergraduate project on sheepdog trials, trying to understand how dogs and humans communicate, and how animal handlers work with their dogs. I especially love this because I have a border collie. I didn't work a picture of him in, but Louis is my pride and joy. And if you take my classes, you'll probably see Louis. Kenzie Brightson worked on feminism, craft, and the revival of knitting, which I don't know if you've seen some places downtown, you'll see knitted objects. She basically found out who was doing it and why they were doing it. It was connected to sexuality, anti-capitalism, the resistance to commodification. So those are just some of the student projects. We're especially strong in supporting student projects in medical anthropology and in development studies. These photos are from Southeast Asia and from Latin America. We work with the PACE program and others to make sure our students get experiences of actually going to some of the places that they hear about. And since 80% of the world survives on $10 a day or less, people who think that development studies is over are really mistaken. In fact, how those countries develop will determine very much what the world looks like in the future, because that's where a lot of the gains need to be made in things like carbon abatement and justice. So I mean, to me, this is incredibly important, morally, politically, and in terms of the economic future of our country. How China develops. So what do we study? I'm going to run down some of the courses really quick, and then I'm going to answer the question. Some of you really want to know, this sounds like a great major, but what the hell kind of careers are there in it? So first, what can you study? In the first year, we have 4 different offerings. Is that right, Pyle? 4? Yeah. In the first semester, there's Drugs Across Cultures, and a new course we've introduced a couple years ago that's increasingly popular called Saints, Shamans, Cults, Demons, the Anthropology of Contemporary Religions. And in semester 2, we have Introduction to Anthropology. I mentioned Aaron's work on infanticide. That's in semester 2. He teaches a course on intro, and I teach the Human Evolution and Diversity course, which looks at not only how humans developed, but what that means for our actual biological diversity. I'm very interested in the relationship between culture and biology and how the two influence each other. So why we have different skin colors, what does it mean? What is it, different places, how they understand that. Beyond that, we have courses like Illness and Healing, which looks at different healing traditions around the world, development studies, culture, myth, and symbolism. We have a course in psychological anthropology that I teach. Anthropology of music and sound, I'm not sure, the person who taught that is leaving us, so I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. We've got 3 new anthropologists coming onto staff, hopefully next year. A lot of exciting new opportunities. A course in Islam, food across cultures, anthropology of politics and culture, culture, health, and sexuality in the developing world, justice and development that looks at legal systems and how development and legal systems are linked, and culture and human rights, where we deal with a range of things from asylum seekers trying to understand what's happening to human rights elsewhere in the world. For example, what do women's rights look like across different cultures, and how do we work actively for women's rights? But in addition to this, you can sort of combine this with a major in development studies. And development studies is fortunate because it brings together some of our leading teachers and researchers from some of our really strong departments in things like environmental sciences and health, as well as the anthropological topics I've been talking about, human geography. So if you're thinking about anthropology, but you're afraid to make a commitment, consider development studies as one possibility. There's some really great people working in this. I know the fellow who just won the university's Researcher of the Year award, Richie, is one of the leading teachers in this from human geography. He does amazing stuff. He's been in Japan for a while, but he's done incredible stuff with indigenous development in geography and use of geographical knowledge to help with indigenous projects here in Australia. All right. We also work hard to provide internships, things like the Aurora Project. A lot of our students have gone to work in native title bodies, on land title cases, or in Aboriginal policy bodies to learn what anthropologists do day to day, how they use their research, how they use their interviewing skills, how they use their negotiation skills in the practice. We've had some of our students who went on to get job offers. So one of our former master's students never finished her master's because after her first or second semester, she did one of these internships and they offered her the #2 job at one of the, I think at the NTS Corp in Redfern. So we're very fortunate for that kind of project. All right, this sounds exciting, but what kind of careers do you have in anthropology? Like, what do you do, right? What do you do if you're not an academic? Well, in fact, most people who do anthropology degrees do not go on to academic careers. And in a few weeks, we're having an academic careers night with former anthropology students who've gone to do everything from political advisors to marketing consultants. I mean, I could list off countless jobs in development projects and social services. There are corporate consultants who are anthropologists, contract archaeology, native title, services to migrants, human rights activists, design consulting like I did, management consulting, intercultural training, social impact assessment, which are the people who go out and assess what the impact of a project is likely to be. So one of our former students worked for the RMS. Back then it was the RTE. I think she's still with them, looking at how highway projects will affect communities and trying to design the best possible highway. So she was involved in the consultation process that led up to bypassing certain towns, for example. Community organizing, but also things like public health, professional researchers. Some of our students have gone on to work on documentary film projects, museum and curating. I mentioned ethnographic film, international business, market research. I won't go through all of them, but I will mention what cool hunting is. Remember a few years back when it was very fashionable to have runners with thick soles on them? Those were actually spotted by an anthropologist working as a cool hunter in New York City. She found that Latino girls in Spanish Harlem were cutting the soles of their shoes and putting thick foam in to make their shoes taller. And she spotted those and took them to a design house, and they made a matzah on selling these shoes. And she was what they call a cool hunter. It is an anthropologist or a field worker who goes out and looks for the next fashion, the next trend, and tries to help companies to make products from it. Look, I'm ambivalent about this process, all right, for a lot of reasons. But it's really science journalism, and one of our former graduates, for example, is involved very much in Western Sydney government. So we get a lot of that. In fact, Australia is the only country where anthropologists have ever been declared to have we had a shortage of anthropologists. Philip Ruddock, the former Attorney General for John Howard, actually said that one of the reasons that native title cases were going so slowly is that there weren't enough anthropologists, because they couldn't figure out who was related to who, they couldn't figure out who had a legitimate claim and who didn't, and that requires anthropologists. And it's not just here in Australia. Last year we had a guy come in who represented part of a team that was doing the same exact thing in Papua New Guinea with a massive LNG project. Not only did they have to figure out who was owed royalties, but they had to try to design ways to get money into the communities that wouldn't just turn into, people getting cut huge checks and having these incredible alcohol and prostitute binges. How do you funnel money into a community so that a community that's getting rich very quickly will actually develop in a healthy, sustainable fashion? So there were anthropologists involved in negotiating every step of that. In fact, he talks about the head office sort of flew in from Texas, from Houston, all these Texans, and they basically said, we just want to send you money. You just got to tell us what we're sending it to. We run the company. We don't want to deal with the people. We just want to deal with the liquid natural gas. We need you guys on the ground to actually design how this is going to happen, where are the roads going to go, who's going to get the jobs, things like that. So anthropologists were involved in that. Lucy Suchman, who's now at Lancaster University in the States, was actually the person who, whenever you look at a copier, there's a green button. All right, it's called the boss button. And Lucy Suchman discovered when she used basically she put video cameras over copiers, that when the secretary was away and the boss came in to use the photocopiers had gotten so complex that Xerox was making that they couldn't figure out how to use them. So she showed this video to the executive board of Xerox, and she said, your machines are too complicated. So now every copier has a green button that basically says copy. And that's for somebody who can just walk up and press that button to make a copy of a letter. And that was because of an anthropologist who studied how the machines were being used. When Kevin Rudd was going to China, at one point when he was criticizing the Chinese, he used a concept, Zhang Yao, the true friend, the friend who's so close that can actually say hard truths to you. That concept was actually, people always assumed it was Kevin Rudd who knew about this. Kevin Rudd had no idea about this concept. He had cultural consultants. He had diplomatic consultants who could tell him what was locally acceptable. And they advised him on how to handle this very delicate situation. And I'm getting close to the end. Marketing and user research, this shows the uptake of ICT technology, but controlled for income. So it compares countries to countries of comparable income. And what you see is that some countries with relatively low incomes have very high uptake of technology. So it turns out South Korea and Estonia are two of the most avid uptake places for new technology, even though their incomes are, adjusting for their income. Anthropologists have been heavily involved in understanding these kinds of phenomena and how new technology can be used. I just was reading a guy's sort of pack it, and they're using ICT to provide medical care in places in Africa where there's no fixed landlines, but a lot of people have mobiles. So how do you use mobiles to help provide health services, including things like prenatal care to mothers? Finally, how can we find local resources to address severe problems? This particular photo comes from a project that was done by anthropologists to try to find local foodstuffs, cheap foodstuffs from local markets that could help HIV victims keep weight on in places in West Africa. Because it turns out that one of the worst things if you have HIV in Africa is not just the virus that's going to get you, it's that you start having a difficult time keeping your body weight up and keeping your health strong. So how do we find local, cheap foodstuffs so they don't have to spend a lot of money or pay a drug company to help keep them healthy? So I think I'm approaching the end. Oh, last one, economic development. Actually, the World Bank hires a lot of anthropologists. Currently, the head of the World Bank is an anthropologist. This Korean Jim Young Kim, who's a really fascinating physician and anthropologist, was appointed by President Obama to head the World Bank. And the reason for it is simple. The World Bank has lots of money, but what they need to know is how the money's actually, what's happening with the money on the ground. And that's where they send in the anthropologists. And I've heard it said that when, because I work in Brazil. So let me just wrap up there. I know it's a bit manic, and I do apologize. I want to thank you and hope you enjoy. If you want any more information, go to .anth.mq.edu.au.